Number 10. The printing press. Imagine living in the 1400s. Every book you've ever seen was handwritten by a monk over months. Then one day, someone walks into your town with hundreds of identical Bibles. Every page, every letter, perfectly identical. When Gutenberg's printing press arrived around 1450, people couldn't explain it. A human hand can't write the same letter perfectly twice, let alone thousands of times. But these printed pages were flawless. To regular people in the 1400s, that was not a machine. That was the devil. Gutenberg's partner, Johann Fust, was accused of witchcraft in Paris for selling printed Bibles. The authorities believed they were conjured by dark magic, a deal with the devil to produce Bibles faster than God intended. A man was almost arrested for selling Bibles because the Bibles were too perfect. The church was terrified for another reason. It lost its control over information. Before, you had to ask a priest what the Bible said. The press changed that overnight. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517. Within months, printed copies had spread across Europe. The church called it witchcraft. What they actually meant was they had lost control, and they were right. Number 9. Salt. You use it every day, but for most of history, salt was considered magic. Everything rots. Meat, fish, vegetables. It was a fact of life. But rub salt on meat and it lasts for months. To someone who had no idea what bacteria was, that's not chemistry. That's a miracle. Or witchcraft. Salt was stopping decay, so people assumed it had power over evil spirits. If it could stop a fish from rotting, it could stop a demon from entering your house. People threw salt in doorways and put it in coffins to stop the dead from returning. The Catholic Church even used it in baptisms to drive out original sin. You might still perform a salt ritual without knowing it. Ever spill salt and toss a pinch over your left shoulder? The left side was considered the devil's side. Spilling precious salt was bad luck, so you'd throw some over your shoulder to blind the demon waiting there. This knowledge made the village healer valuable but also suspicious. If you knew how to use salt to ward off evil, maybe you also knew how to invite it in. The person who could heal you could also curse you. One bad harvest, and the woman who knew her salt was called a witch. Number 8. Spices. Imagine a medieval peasant's diet. Boiled meat and brown mush every single day. Then a merchant shows up with a tiny pouch of brown powder. He sprinkles it on your food, and suddenly your brown mush tastes like something worth living for. You would absolutely think that man was a wizard. That powder was nutmeg. Back then, no one in Europe knew where it came from. It arrived from unknown lands, carried by strangers in tiny pouches. No one had seen the tree it grew on. Large amounts of nutmeg are also hallucinogenic. It makes your heart race. You see things. With no scientific explanation, the only conclusion was enchantment. Pepper had a similar reputation. It was so rare it was used as currency. People paid rent and settled debts with it. Cinnamon was even more mysterious. To protect their supply routes, traders told Europeans it was harvested from giant bird nests on unclimbable cliffs, and people believed it for centuries. Because when something makes your food taste magical, and no one can explain it, witchcraft is a reasonable guess. Number 7. Butter churns. That creamy, golden butter on your table was basically a confession in the Middle Ages. Making butter was hard. You'd churn cream for hours, but sometimes it just wouldn't work, staying liquid no matter what. Medieval people needed an explanation. They weren't going to blame bad technique or warm weather. No, they blamed Margaret from down the road. The belief was that a witch could magically steal the richness from your cream. Your butter failed because a witch's invisible hands took the good stuff. If your neighbor's butter came out perfect every time, that was the smoking gun. She wasn't just skilled, she was stealing your butter's richness for her own. People developed anti-witch rituals, like dropping a red-hot horseshoe into the cream. The burning iron was meant to hurt the witch's invisible hands, a booby trap for supernatural dairy thieves. The reality was simple science. Butter doesn't churn if the cream is too warm. On a hot day, your butter failed. On a cool day, your neighbors succeeded. Instead of checking the temperature, people checked their neighbors for a deal with the devil. Number 6. Tomatoes. The thing you put on your sandwich was once considered straight-up witchcraft. For approximately 200 years, Europeans refused to eat tomatoes. They called them poison apples, and they weren't entirely wrong to be suspicious. Rich people who ate tomatoes kept dying. A nobleman would eat some for dinner and be dead within weeks. It happened repeatedly, but the tomato wasn't killing anyone. The plates were. Rich Europeans used pewter plates, which were loaded with lead. The high acidity in tomatoes leached lead from the plate into the food. Every time a nobleman ate tomatoes, he was getting a slow dose of poison. Meanwhile, the poor ate off wooden plates. No lead. They ate tomatoes and were fine, while the rich kept dying. The rich looked at this and concluded the tomato must specifically hate wealthy people, which is a very reasonable conclusion if you don't know what lead poisoning is. So for centuries, the tomato was just a decorative plant in European gardens. People grew them, admired them, but refused to eat them. Number 5. Forks. You probably grabbed a fork for dinner without a second thought. But in medieval Europe, that could get you accused of witchcraft. Forks arrived in Europe in the 11th century when a Byzantine princess brought one to Venice. She used it to eat instead of her hands. The church watched this and absolutely lost it. Priests started preaching against the fork from the pulpit, actual sermons about a fork. Their argument, God gave you hands to eat with. Using a metal tool instead meant you thought God's design was flawed, and only the devil would suggest that. So they called forks the devil's tines. To the medieval church, a tiny metal pitchfork was basically Satan's cutlery. The princess who brought the fork to Venice died young from an illness. The church pointed at her death as proof. This lasted for centuries. Well into the 1600s, people avoided forks to not be associated with witchcraft, preferring to eat with their hands than risk being called a devil worshipper. Eventually, forks became normal, and now you can buy a pack of 50 for $2. Number 4. Popcorn. Imagine you're a 16th century farmer who's never seen popcorn. Someone tosses a tiny rock-hard kernel into a fire. Instead of burning, it explodes into a fluffy, amazing-smelling white cloud. You would lose your mind. Imagine someone handed you a pebble today, threw it in a fire, and it turned into a marshmallow. That's what popcorn looked like to people seeing it for the first time. Naturally, people assumed something supernatural was happening inside that kernel. Some Native American tribes believed a spirit lived inside each kernel. When the kernel got hot, the spirit got angry, and the explosion was the spirit bursting out, which is a more interesting explanation than steam pressure and starch. The kernel doesn't just change shape, it gets 40 to 50 times bigger. That's like throwing a grape into a fire and pulling out a grapefruit. Early Europeans had no framework for this. No science class, no internet, just a tiny hard thing instantly becoming a giant soft thing. Pure, unexplainable magic. Number 3. Potatoes. The thing you eat with every meal was once considered a tool of the devil. When potatoes first arrived in Europe from South America in the 1500s, people were terrified. They grew underground, in the dark. To Europeans, anything from underground came from one place, down there, where the bad guy lives. France banned potatoes for almost 200 years, not because they tasted bad, but because people believed eating one could give you leprosy. The logic was simple and insane. Potatoes looked bumpy and weird. Leprosy made skin look bumpy and weird. Therefore, potatoes caused leprosy. People also thought witches used them in rituals, digging them up at night to bury curses inside them. Apparently, witches had nothing better to do than mess with root vegetables. The church agreed, potatoes aren't in the Bible. If God didn't mention it, it must be from somewhere worse. It took French pharmacist Antoine Parmentier to change minds. He planted a potato field and hired armed guards to protect it by day. At night, he sent the guards home. Locals, assuming anything guarded must be valuable, started stealing the potatoes. He tricked an entire country into eating them. Number 2. Grafted plants. Imagine walking through a medieval village and spotting a tree growing both apples and pears. Same tree, 2 different fruits. To us, that's a cool gardening trick. To your medieval neighbor, that is straight up demonic. Farmers discovered grafting. Cut a branch from one tree, attach it to another, and they fuse. The branch keeps growing, pulling nutrients from its new host. But to people in the 1400s, this was forcing nature to do something unnatural. God made apple trees for apples and pear trees for pears. Combining them was telling God he got it wrong. The person doing it must be channeling dark power. How else would they know this was possible? The knowledge itself was suspect. Now grafting is how almost every fruit you eat is grown. Your apples, your grapes for wine, it's used in virtually every commercial orchard on the planet. The thing that would have gotten you burned at the stake is now just basic agriculture. Number 1. Dolls. A child's toy, or a long-distance torture device. Depends on who you ask. You make a small figure that looks like someone you hate. You stick a pin in its leg, and somewhere across town, your enemy suddenly grabs their leg in pain. These were called poppets, and people took them very seriously. Cultures from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe looked at a small human-shaped object and thought it could be used to hurt someone. The idea was a spiritual connection. What you did to the doll happened to the person. A pin in the heart caused chest pains. Burying it made the person waste away. Poppets weren't just for hurting people. They were used for control, to make someone fall in love with you or do your bidding. During the Salem witch trials, Bridget Bishop was found with poppets, rag dolls with pins, in her walls. This was a death sentence in 1692. She was the first person executed in Salem. All over dolls in a wall. Modern science found something uncomfortable, the nocebo effect. If you believe a poppet is being used against you, your brain can actually create the pain. It's the evil twin of the placebo effect. So the witchcraft wasn't in the doll, it was in the belief, which is somehow both less scary and